it's like in U.S., right? People blame Mexican immigrants. People blame all the economic ills. It's a lot easier just to blame the immigrants. Very similar dynamic is happening in Hong Kong, and what instead of focusing, say, like on the on the class aspect of it, most people say, "Oh, look, we had it so good back in the 80s and 90s, right? When it was still under the British rule. Look at us now." So there are legitimate issues, but these issues often, yeah, it just gets misdirected. Misdirected to a very ugly nativism sentiment. And in 2014, during the umbrella movement, Occupy movement of Hong Kong, it was financed by Jimmy Lai, a big media tycoon of Hong Kong, who is kind of like the Rupert Murdoch figure because he runs Apple Daily, the largest tabloid in circulation in Hong Kong. And his media empire was very, like the Apple Daily is very, very anti-China. And in 2014, in addition to finance the Occupy movement, and there appeared an ad in Apple Daily that compare all the mainlanders to locusts. There was a big poster of these giant locusts flying over Hong Kong, and says, "People of Hong Kong, don't you have enough? Have all these locusts coming here to take up our resources?"
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by Max Blumenthal, and today we're going to talk about something that is all over the corporate media, that is Hong Kong, where there have been some violent protests going on now for the past 2 months. Every single US politician has said something about it, the vast majority expressing support for the protests. So we're going to talk today about what is actually happening inside the country, and we have one of the best potential guests to discuss it. We are joined by Carl Zha, who is a China expert. You might have seen him on Twitter. He's very active there. And he's also the host of a really good podcast of his own called Silk and Steel, the Silk and Steel podcast, where he talks about Chinese history, Chinese politics. Carl grew up in China and is one of the most active, people on social media talking about what's going on in Hong Kong. Thanks for joining us, Carl.
Thank you. I'm extremely online, yes.
And I wanted to say, too, that Carl is actually joining us right now from Indonesia in Bali. I'm in Caracas, Venezuela, where I'll be here for a few months. And Max is joining us actually in Washington, D.C. So we're on 3 different continents. So not only we are extremely online, but we're extremely international.
Yes.
Yes. And, I am in a place that Donald Trump has declared yesterday on Twitter has absolutely nothing to do with what's happening in Hong Kong. He said, I can't imagine why people are blaming us for what's going on there. And honestly, I mean, Trump is not the sharpest guy, but on many things. But it's kind of understandable that he would make that statement, given the narrative of the U.S. government, the people around him who are, running the show there, and who are running his foreign policy to a large degree, as well as the U.S. media that acts as its sort of unofficial arm. And they are painting these protests as a very organic grassroots youth uprising. The protests ostensibly mobilized, they reached their peak over the anti-extradition law, but the extradition law was withdrawn and the protests continued, which reminded me a lot of the Maidan protests, which began over a economic association agreement with the EU that the government of Yanukovych didn't want to do. And then, that was withdrawn, I think, and then the protests just continued to a regime change situation. And in Nicaragua last year, there were protests over mild reforms to the social security system. And then after Daniel Ortega, the president, withdrew that, the protests continued and moved towards a regime change situation. In each case, the protesters had this apparatus behind them that was backed with U.S. money. And so to me, looking from the outside, it does seem like we're witnessing a color revolution. But Carl, you know a lot more than both of us combined. I wonder what you think and what your analysis of what's happening is.
I think it is important to address the issue of Hong Kong from a leftist and progressive side, because there's a lot of confusion about Hong Kong right now, mainly because of lack of information and the context around it. The root of the Hong Kong unrest really goes all the way back to the colonial past of Hong Kong, because as most of us already know, Hong Kong was taken away from China during the first Opium War, when British literally sent gunboats down the Yangtze River to force then the Chinese government, the Qing imperial government, to sign away Hong Kong. And they did it that 3 times actually. After the first Opium War, Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain forever. And then after the second Opium War, the Kwai Lung Peninsula, just opposite of the Hong Kong Island, was again ceded to Britain. And after the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, when all the Western powers saw that even a newly industrialized Japan could defeat China, everybody moved in and everybody wanted a piece of China. And then British able to secure another land lease on Chinese mainland, just north of Kwai Lung Peninsula, called New Territory. This is the largest piece of land in Hong Kong. And that land was leased to Britain for 99 years. And so it was due for renewal, or the lease expires in 1997. And in 1980s, when the Thatcher government realized the lease was about to expire, they went to the Chinese government and they want to renew the lease. That was their original intention, to renew the lease on Hong Kong.
It's like you go meet with your landlord to renew the lease on your apartment, but in this case, it's actually like an entire country and it's a colony. Like, we're going to renew the lease on our colony.
Right, and then Deng Xiaoping said no. And at that point, Thatcher actually went to his British Defense Department and asked the generals to draft an emergency plan for defending Hong Kong. And the top military brass had to sat her down and tell her, actually, sorry, man, that's impossible. Right?
Not the Falklands. It's not the Falklands.
Yeah, this is not like 1840s anymore. We're not able to physically defend Hong Kong from attack from mainland. And so that's when Thatcher was forced to go back to negotiation tables with the Chinese government. And in 1984, that's when both sides come up with this Sino-British joint declaration on Hong Kong. And the content of that declaration was all of Hong Kong, New Territory, Hong Kong Island, Kwai Lung Peninsula, everything will be returned to China on 1997. And the terms and condition was that China agree in the declaration to keep the system of Hong Kong as is. China promised not to impose a socialist system in Hong Kong. So this is what's called one country, two system, right? So the mainland China will have its own system. Hong Kong will keep going the way it is, the so-called free-wheeling capitalist society that Hong Kong is will go on to continue its way. That was initially the deal. And then after 1989, the Tiananmen Square protests in China, at the time, there was a lot of sympathy in Hong Kong for the student protests. As much of the world and in China as well. And but in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square protest, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, decided, now I'm going to do an electoral reform. Now, British rule Hong Kong as like a colony ruled by the colonial governor for basically most of its Hong Kong's history. You know, Hong Kong didn't have election, didn't have democracy. But after 1984, after British agreed to hand over to China in 1997, Britain started a limited electoral reform. And what they did was not a one person, one vote system, but they have this so-called constitution. What's that word say? Constituency system, where they allot certain votes for the business.
Constituency?
Yes, thank you. So where they allot a side of votes set aside just for the business sector, for the lawyers and the doctors, right? And that China was okay with that limited form of democracy in Hong Kong. And the deal was, China will keep that system past 1997. But by 1994, just 3 years before the handover, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, he decided he's going to push a full democratic reform. He's just going to liberalize the election law further, right? I mean, I think it's hard to argue suffrage, right? I mean, I think universal suffrage is good. But what Chris Patten did back then was he did it to spite Beijing because a handover is only 3 years away. And this was 1993, 1994. This is right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is right after, collapse of communism in all of Eastern Europe. At the time, China was one of the last few left standing, right? Last few communist countries left standing. So at the time, the expectation was that China itself might collapse soon. In fact, we have America's #1 China expert, Gordon Chan, who wrote a book in 2001 called The Coming Collapse of China, which he had to revise the date every year. It's been 18 years now, so he just appeared on CNN to talk about Hong Kong.
Yeah, they still have him on all the time. I mean, this shows that if you're arguing in support of the empire, then you will always fail up. You'll always be rewarded, and you'll always be invited to talk more lies on CNN.
Well, sorry to cut in, but one of the things about Gordon Chang is that I think there's a professor who is an actual credentialed expert named Gordon Chang at Stanford, and I think he gets confused for him a lot. But the Gordon Chang who goes on CNN is a tax lawyer. He's not even a credentialed expert, but neither are we, but we somehow, we're not academically credentialed, but you somehow knew that China wouldn't collapse. So anyway.
So in 1994, Chris Patten decided to push through the electoral reform that would widen the electoral base. At the time, China was against it because China thought they already have a deal with Britain, right? That they're going to keep the system as is before 1990s to pass over 1997. And suddenly they feel Chris Patten is changing the rule of the game. And this was a big friction point between UK and China, and also the pan-democratic camp of Hong Kong, who just got elected in the new election of 1995. So right after the handover, 1997, that the Legislative Council that was elected in 1995, 2 years prior, was dismissed, was replaced with a provincial Legislative Council. And the following year, in 1998, there was a new election based on pre-1994 election laws. right? So in a way, I mean, I think there's some legitimate criticism of China, right? Well, one is that he kind of kept that colonial structure from the British colonial days, kept it intact. There's a couple of reasons why China did that. One is after 1989, after the Tiananmen Square protests, China was isolated diplomatically, internationally. And a lot of the people in Hong Kong, the business class people in Hong Kong were spooked, right? So China, in an effort to prevent capital flight and to reassure the Hong Kong business community, they promised to keep everything the same. Right, and in fact, this is around 1990s. That's when there was a big immigration wave to Canada and some parts of U.S. from Hong Kong because people were uncertain about the future, the post-handover future in 1997. So a lot of people bought real estate housing in Vancouver, and many of them, after they got their green cards or Canadian passport, they went back to Hong Kong to work. Right, because Canada was just kind of last resort, and it was under that kind of situation that China decided, okay, we're just gonna make the business community happy. We're gonna promise to keep everything as is, one country, two system. Nothing is gonna change, right? And what ended up happening is that the Hong Kong government, the Hong Kong legislature, end up being dominated entirely by business interests of Hong Kong, by the Hong Kong oligarchy, right? Back in the British colonial days, it was pretty bad, but at least there was kind of a division of power because at then the most of the power was in the hands of the British colonial governor, and the legislature was kind of more. Was more like a rubber stamp and it was limited power. But after
Quislings, yeah.
Yeah, so to give an example why things didn't work out so well for Hong Kong under this the current arrangement is that during the British colonial days, the Hong Kong government were building about 20,000 unit of public housing, families starting out, right, at affordable, subsidized price. Because in Hong Kong, the real estate price is just super expensive, and the rent and the housing price is a big issue. And one of the costs is because the Hong Kong government itself was artificially inflating the land price, because Hong Kong government derived most of its revenue from the land sales to developers. And people think like, oh, Hong Kong housing price is so expensive. It's because Hong Kong is so tiny, right, with so many people. But actually, Hong Kong has a lot of land. I mentioned before the new territory, that huge piece of land on in north of Hong Kong. A lot of that is still like farmland, but Hong Kong government intentionally only a very small amount of land for development each year to drive up the housing price. And basically, they do that in cahoots with real estate tycoons of Hong Kong. If you look at the Hong Kong's richest families, richest men in Hong Kong, all the top 10, they're all real estate developers. And now they have political power as well because they dominate the Hong Kong legislature. And the end result is housing become increasingly unaffordable for working class Hong Kong people. During the colonial times, this was addressed by Hong Kong government building a certain number of public housing units. Like I said, they will build 30 to 20K public housing each year. After the handover, after 1997, Chinese central government was actually very hands-off on Hong Kong. What that translated into is Hong Kong government is completely dominated by the Hong Kong business elite, which means the local real estate developers. And so Hong Kong government went from building 20 to 30K unit of public housing per year to building 2K, to building only 2,000 unit of public housing per year. I mean, that's a drastic reduction. And I don't know if you guys noticed in Hong Kong protests, the protesters skew very young, right? Most of these protesters actually never experienced the colonial rule of Hong Kong under Britain, because most of them grew up after 1997, after the handover. And it's during this time that Hong Kong's economy was changed drastically. One thing was that the Hong Kong started out as a manufacturing hub. It was like a window. It was because after the communists came to power in China in 1949, all the rich capitalists they fled Shanghai, the previous largest city in China. They took all their capital, their money, their expertise. They went to Hong Kong, and then because what happened in China, the Chinese Civil War, a huge wave of Chinese refugees rushed into Hong Kong to provide cheap labor. These are the ingredients that really brought development in Hong Kong. There's this combination of the capital's flight from China and the refugees providing the cheap labor, and especially there were several waves of refugees. There was also another wave in the 1960s during the Great Chinese Famine, and also because after 1949 there was a Western blockade that was placed on the Chinese mainland. So cities like Shanghai lost their status as main trading port, and Hong Kong became the only window for China to do business with the outside world. And that's why, that this combination of factors, that's what made Hong Kong's economic takeoff from like economic backwater before 1949 to a boomtown in 1980s and 1990s. The 1980s and 1990s was the golden age of Hong Kong. At that time, Hong Kong was producing tons of movies. That was a golden age for the Hong Kong cinema as well. Hong Kong has a lot of soft power. It was producing all these movies, dramas for the Chinese community all over the world.
Right, and their action films are legendary in the U.S.
Yes, and it was, and this was a time when China was just opening up after a ravage of Cultural Revolution, and China was desperately poor. In the 1980s, it was pretty common for, like, say, a taxi driver in Hong Kong to walk across the border to China and set himself up with a mistress across the border. I mean, like, anybody who had a job in Hong Kong could literally just set himself up with a couple mistresses across the border in mainland. So there was the Hong Kong people were used to to seeing their mainland Chinese counterparts as these poor country cousins, right? But things started to change in 1990s, especially post handover, because the prior manufacturing hub that was Hong Kong, all the manufacturing now get offsourced to China, because all the Hong Kong capitalists, they take their capital and build their factory in China where the labor is much cheaper. And what Hong Kong then is left with, it's left with finance and real estate, right? And it's turning into a service economy. So what we have right now is people in Hong Kong, the young people in Hong Kong actually, what they face is a diminished economic prospect, especially as right now, as China itself, mainland China is developing, right? Hong Kong is no longer the only window, only portal for China to do trade with the outside world. Now there's Shanghai, there's Shenzhen, there's Guangzhou, there's Beijing. Foreign business can go straight to Shanghai and do business over there. And and the Hong Kong, um, the Hong Kong economy post manufacturing just simply is not providing the kind of the good living as it used to. I mean, it's just the same kind of issue that, and I think it's very similar to the youth in the West as well, right? I mean, the people in United States, in Europe, are all facing the same issues. The manufacturing.
You have this nativist tone in the protests. Hong Kong for Hong Kongers. What's this guy Edward Long, who's from the indigenous movement, is kind of crafted the slogan. He's really shaped the whole tone of the protests. And this is someone who had harassed Chinese tourists who had come over from the mainland, who's in jail right now. Yes. And this really does remind me of, there is a parallel to the West where the far right nativist parties in Europe are rising and Donald Trump is the president. In the U.S., there's obviously an identitarian kind of identity politics angle to it, but there's also an material economic component as well. So basically what I'm asking is, how does you've set the kind of economic backdrop. How does this play into the 2014 Occupy Central umbrella movement and the protests we're seeing today?
Yes. So there are some legitimate concerns, legitimate discontent among the Hong Kong youth. They're facing with a diminished economic prospect, right? They're seeing whereas the mainland Chinese, their former poor country cousins are getting doing better and better, right? And now but instead of all these anger, this discontent, getting focused on the domination of the Hong Kong economy and the Hong Kong politics by the Hong Kong business elite and oligarchy. Instead of that, a lot of this discontent get redirected instead to mainlanders, right? Like mainlanders gets blamed because they get blamed for coming to Hong Kong, buying up housing to drive up the real estate prices. They get blamed for coming to Hong Kong, buying up baby milk powder. Because there was a incident in China, there was a big scandal where one baby milk manufacturer used deadly chemicals in baby milk powder and caused deformity among babies. So that destroys the reputation of all domestic dairy producers in China. So the mainland Chinese were seeking to source their milk and milk product overseas. The easiest things for them to do is go to Hong Kong and buy baby milk powder. So people were focused on those things. They're blaming all their. It's like in U.S., right? People blame Mexican immigrants. People blame all the economic yields. It's a lot easier just to blame the immigrants. Very similar dynamic is happening in Hong Kong, and what instead of focusing, say, like on the on the class aspect of it, most people say, "Oh, look, we had it so good back in the 80s and 90s, right? When you were still under the British rule. Look at us now, right? And now we're just working at some dead end jobs with no way to afford our own house, and the rent is skyrocketing." So there are legitimate issues, but these issues often in kind of like because it just gets misdirected to a very ugly nativism sentiment. And in 2014, during the umbrella movement, Occupy movement of Hong Kong, it was financed by Jimmy Lai, a big media tycoon of Hong Kong, who is kind of like the Rupert Murdoch figure because he runs Apple Daily, the largest tabloid in circulation in Hong Kong. And he's very anti-Chinese government. So for personal reasons, because he was forced to give up his clothing fashion business in China for his stance against the Chinese government after Tiananmen Square protests. And he had to sell his shares in his company Giordano, and after that he took all that money to start his media empire. And his media empire was very, like, the Apple Daily is very, very anti-China. And in 2014, in addition to finance the Occupy movement, and there appeared an ad in Apple Daily that compare all the mainlanders to locusts. There was a big poster of these giant locusts flying over Hong Kong, and says, people of Hong Kong, don't you have enough? Have all these locusts coming here to take up our resources? All these pregnant locusts coming to our hospital giving birth. This is when at the time, initially Hong Kong, because the Chinese government promised to keep the colonial rule in Hong Kong, including immigration rules, right? So for mainland Chinese people to visit Hong Kong, they will still need visa. They still need to get stamp on their passport. And but one of the thing that Hong Kong government was trying to do was also trying to limit immigration from mainland. And one of the thing was they tried. There was a push. They were trying to deny people who were born into Hong Kong to get Hong Kong residence permit, right? And the mainland Chinese government was actually okay with that, because they, hey, one country, two system, you can do whatever you want in Hong Kong. But at the time, that decision was reversed by the Hong Kong Supreme Court, because a lot of people were saying this is a violation of human rights. People who were born in Hong Kong should have rights to reside in Hong Kong. And they reversed the decision. What happened was a lot of mainland pregnant mainland women, they will come to Hong Kong and give birth, so their babies will have the Hong Kong residence permit, right? They have some of that in U.S. right now too. They're called the anchor babies, right?
Yeah.
And so this become a hot political issue in Hong Kong. That they're against these anchor babies. So they're saying all these in the poster that appeared in Apple Daily with a locust. In the words, it says all these pregnant locusts coming to Hong Kong, right? Taking up our resources of our hospitals, having you are all the taxpayers of money of Hong Kong, to fund all this, the birth of the baby locusts, right? They're literally calling the mainland Chinese locusts, and that kind of nativism aspect of the Hong Kong protest movement is rarely covered, if at all, in the Western media. We rarely hear about it.
Yeah, and this is actually a good segue. I was going to ask you, you talked about the oligarchs who really control Hong Kong politics, and how there is this kind of there's this kind of congruence here between the interest of oligarchs and the interest of these kind of right-wing nativists who are against mainland Chinese. And this is also interesting because in the past few days, today is August 14th, in the past few days there have been a series of articles in mainstream corporate media outlets in which billionaires from Hong Kong have been lamenting, actually, that the protests are now, at this point, causing them to lose a lot of money, even though many of these billionaires at first supported the anti-extradition bill protests. So I think what's interesting is that specifically there's this billionaire Peter Wu. Peter Wu is a Hong Kong billionaire, the 8th richest man in the country, who had something around $13 billion. And in the past several weeks, as the economy has plummeted because of the extreme violent protests going on, as the airport was shut down for 2 days, he's actually lost $1 billion, this real estate tycoon. And what's interesting is if you read the articles, Peter Wu says, I was cheering on the protests at the beginning. We were against the extradition bill. And when there is discussion of the extradition bill, largely in Chinese media, people rightfully point out that one of the reasons for the bill was this horrific case of this guy who killed and cut up his girlfriend but he was not. The Chinese government was not able to extradite him for murder because there was no extradition bill, and that's a horrific case. But also what's interesting is
he killed his Hong Kong girlfriend and he ran back to Taiwan, right? And because there's no extradition treaty, right? Like Hong Kong government are unable to extract him from Taiwan. So the murder is at large right now, and that was one of the initial reasons for the extradition bill. But extradition bill, in my opinion, right, it's really just a trigger for the protest. It's not even the cause. I mean, people are billing this extradition bill as like, oh, this is gonna enable the mainland government to extract the political dissidents, to get them tortured on mainland, blah blah blah. But the extradition bill was actually very specific, right? It was at the Hong Kong court's discretion on who they allowed to be extradited, right? But those nuances, details are getting lost.
As in every color revolution, there's a spark that's misrepresented through social media and elsewhere, and then that people get in the streets, and it becomes about the larger issues.
Well, Carl, I was going to also say that it seems that what I was getting at is it seems to me that at the beginning, the spark was also that there were some Hong Kong oligarchs, some billionaires who were afraid that if the extradition bill passes, they could be extradited. So that's one of the reasons these billionaires were supporting the protest at first. But like you said, after the bill was discarded, the regime change attempt escalated, and then now some of the billionaires are actually against it.
Yes, I mean, there's actually some thing that we can tie back to the West. Like for example, Canada, and I think U.S. as well do not have extradition treaties with China. So a lot of the crooks who commit financial crimes in China, they go to Canada. They seek a political asylum. They go to Canada because the Canadian immigration process is easier than U.S. after 9/11. So they go to Canada, seek a political asylum, and they're able to, live their lives with their ill-gotten gain, right, in Canada.
Well, it's the same thing here in Venezuela. There are so many former corrupt officials and oligarchs who stole a bunch of money from the government here in Venezuela and then fled to Miami. In fact, in the past week, Samuel Moncada, the Venezuelan ambassador to the UN, citing WikiLeaks files, exposed that there is a major opposition journalist here in Venezuela he used to live here, who was actually a spy for the US government, who was an informant. And where is he? Of course, he's living in the US now because they're not going to be extradited.
Of course, and I mean the extradition bill itself will probably end up affecting very few people, if any, among the protesters out on the street. But really, what drives people to protest in Hong Kong is this: they feel this unease, right, about China, about mainland China, because China has a different political system, right, and also the discontent they feel about their own economic situation in Hong Kong. They feel like China is to blame, right, for the economic malaise in Hong Kong itself, and so the really extradition bill was just trigger. It's a trigger for all the youngins to get out there to express their discontent. I mean, they have legitimate discontent. So I wouldn't say the whole thing was just. I mean, sometimes we do give too much credit to CIA, right? Like we gave them too much power. But there were some legitimate local concern, local discontent. But those discontent end up being leveraged by this, and the U.S.'s role, right? I mean, like if you look at Hong Kong, who is to benefit if Hong Kong get destabilized, right? China does not want to see Hong Kong get destabilized, right? It's the last thing that China wants to see is a Hong Kong that's in chaos. Because even though China has other up and coming Chinese cities right now, Hong Kong is still a very important financial hub. A lot of the Chinese mainland companies still go list on the Hong Kong stock market to raise capital, right? Like Hong Kong is still very, very important. Like it's in China's interest to keep the business as usual, right? But right now, what's fanning the protests, right? I mean, like people are trying to the Hong Kong protesters were caught. The one of the Hong Kong protest leader, Joshua Wong, was caught. Was filmed meeting the political officer of U.S. consulate in Hong Kong, Judy. What's her last name? I can't pronounce her last name.
Ida?
Yeah.
Ida. I don't know how to pronounce it, but Eadeh. Ida.
Yeah. And they were seeing on the I think it was a JW Marriott in Hong Kong, and somebody made a comment on Twitter. They said, "Oh my God, I thought that was Victoria Nuland. I thought she looked exactly like Victoria Nuland." and it was, of course, a reference to Victoria Nuland handing out cookies on Maidan, right? And I mean, like, CIA is definitely there to meddle. I don't think we can give them the full credit for getting everything. Light. They maybe light the fuse, right? But the discount. We shouldn't delegitimize the discontent people were feeling on the ground. So there were some issues, some local issues. But what U.S. State Department often do is to exploit these problems in these host societies and to exacerbate and escalate. And in fact, one of the tactic of the Hong Kong protesters is escalation. They had an article published in New York Times, an opinion page. I think the title is the tactic of the Hong Kong protesters: how to get the police to hit you. They were openly talking about this marginal violence theory, where the goal is to escalate, hopefully non-violently, but maybe sometimes with a little bit of violence, to get a police overreaction. And once police react, they can win people to their side, right? And that was literally their published tactic. And that's the playbook they've been following in the Hong Kong protests. Like one of the, as you already talked about, the extradition bill was suspended, right, after the initial large peaceful protest that happened in Hong Kong. But what happened right after that? Right after that, a small group of protesters took to storm the Hong Kong legislature building. They broke inside, vandalized everything. I mean, this is literally day after the Hong Kong government announced they're going to suspend the bill.
They broke in, they destroyed everything, and they hung up the British colonial flag inside the legislature.
Yes, and you know, like people. It's amazing sometimes to watch like Twitter in real time. You know, people were saying, "Oh, this is just maybe it's a false flag, right?" And but maybe it's like the police infiltrators, the provocateur. And then you have like the Hong Kong protest leader themselves tweeting. It's like, "Yeah, we took over the legislature. Look at me!" And they post their selfies on social media.
Well, it reminds me that anytime that there is something that's very inconvenient for the U.S. empire, all these neoliberal journalists say, "Oh, it's obviously a false flag." I'm thinking of specifically the case where there was a drone assassination attempt against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and there were all these media outlets, Casey Michel, I think Progress, The Guardian, they all said that it was a false flag, fake attack, and then it was later exposed several months later that the people who carried out the attack were the Venezuelan opposition in collaboration with the U.S. and Colombian governments based in Miami. And then everyone just stops talking about it.
By the way, Ben, fun fact, Casey Michel works for Thor Halvorsen at his fake human rights foundation. Thor Halvorsen is the first cousin of Leopoldo Lopez, who's under house arrest for several coup attempts, including the most recent one. So anyway, yes, there's that. And the fact that if you dare point to the violence of the opposition, you get mercilessly attacked online. I remember, when I was pointing to the presence of neo-Nazis in Maidan, I got called Putin's puppet or something, Putin's useful idiot in the New York Times. I'm like, finally, I got mentioned in the New York Times, but just strange mention. But, what we've seen, it hasn't been the moderate violence theory or whatever. It has been, the rank and file of the protests increasingly starting in July, but really this month, just lashing out at everything with full fury. You've seen Molotov cocktails thrown into intersections to block traffic. You've seen vehicles getting attacked for trying to go through roadblocks. The drivers getting punched for getting out of their vehicles. Opponents getting beaten in the street with clubs. A reporter was surrounded, I think at the airport, and forced to delete her photos. And another reporter was beaten senseless because he was from a Chinese government outlet. I mean, he's basically lynched. And you've seen petrol bombs thrown at police officers. So, and you've been really exposing a lot of these scenes on your Twitter account. Ben, I mean, we should play right now the video of someone being carted off in a stretcher at the airport, and someone rushes up with a U.S. flag and the stars and stripes and smashes the wounded person in the head. I mean, this is incredible. So, what is this violence like? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from just the sheer hatred, the sheer nativist hatred you described of Chinese people from the mainland, or is this a tactic? And do you think the violence is really going to increase to a higher degree?
I think right now that's what it looks like, because there's an escalation ladder, right? We first saw the storming of the Hong Kong Legislative Council. At that time, people were like, "Oh my God, this is terrible." But it just went more and more. What you see, there's a lot of cameras in Hong Kong protests, right? There's a lot of press, there's a lot of journalists, and what you see is the protesters, they will throw projectiles, they will go charge the police line, and then get the police to fire tear gas, and then they will film it and like, oh my God, police is firing tear gas. Police then I mean, I'm not justifying police brutality, right? I think Hong Kong police is ill-equipped, ill-trained to handle large-scale protests like this. They just not. They're just not. They never faced something like this before, and they have not been able to handle this, let's say, as best as they could be doing.
They are being kind of besieged in their barracks, aren't they? The protesters are actually going to police stations, using laser pointers and throwing things at them.
Yeah, I'm going to play a video here. And what's crazy about this video is that for anyone who has followed our work on Nicaragua and Venezuela, it's the same tactics. Now in this video, you're going to see there is a burning barricade with huge flames in front of a police station that's preventing the police from leaving their barracks. And then you can see in this video that we're playing here that you have these so-called protesters who set all this stuff on fire and made this barricade, and then they're shining lasers in the eyes of police who are trying to put water on the fire to prevent them from putting out the fire. This is the same exact tactic that was used here in Venezuela during what was called the guarimbas. And of course, the thing is, the way this strategy works is that the Western corporate media ignores these acts of violence that are intentional forms of provocation. They want the police to respond, but the Western corporate media ignores the actual acts of violence and only shows the self-defense from the state, from the government, in response to these insurgents. And here in Venezuela, we saw burning barricades like this. We saw people putting up wires that beheaded people who were driving by. We saw the far-right opposition, backed by the U.S., was burning people alive, black Venezuelans and Chavistas alive. In Nicaragua, Max can talk about the tranques. It's the same thing.
This is, I think, like, so yes, yesterday, after the violence at the airport, right? I mean, even the CNN reporter who was there on the ground, even he was disgusted by the mob violence that was. They basically held a mainland Chinese. They held two mainland Chinese guy in detention. They zip tied them, and the crowd took turns to beat them for several hours. And the one of the men collapsed twice. They searched all their belongings and documents. They got their ID, and somebody supposedly Googled their name and say, "Oh, this name matches like a name of a police officer in mainland, so he must be a police infiltrator." So I mean, they became a judge, jury, and executioner, and this happened. This was live streamed all over the world, and like my mainland cousin in China, he was able to watch this live. For this mainland Chinese guy in Hong Kong airport being held by the protester, be beaten, and when the paramedics come to rescue him, the protester actually blocked the paramedics for hours from leaving the airport while the guy was in serious danger, because the guy literally collapsed many times. And so people were, like the people on the mainland Chinese side, they watch this, they're very angry. But I mean, I think some of that, I believe, is in touch. It is part from that nativist hatred. Right, but there's another part is because I think there's the mass psychology of all these protesters. They felt so self-righteous about their cause, and in part they're being egged on by all the media, right? And right now, like almost all the Western mainstream media is on their side, and they felt emboldened, empowered, and they felt they could do no wrong. That's why they even do such kind of extreme action as holding some common travelers, do a body search, tie them up, beat them, denying, all these crowds of people in the airport, preventing paramedics from getting through to give him medical treatment. I mean, there's some kind of and I watched this on tweet when I posted these videos on Twitter, right? There are many supporters of the protest, come up with all these reasons, justifications on why it's okay, right? I mean, I think it's
Carl. Let me ask you. Let me jump in and ask you. I mean, Melissa Chan, who was thrown out of China in 2012 when she was at Al Jazeera, she's now at Deutsche Welle, which is a state media outlet of Germany. She's at the Global Journalism Center, which is funded by the Canadian government, which is supporting these protests. She tweeted a justification of or downplayed the beating of this journalist from Global Times, the brutal beating. I mean, he was twice beaten into unconsciousness, and said, well, he's not really a journalist because he works for the bad guy outlet. I work for the good guys. He works for the bad guys. But she also tweeted that, all these travelers complaining about being like pushed around and roughed up on their way to the departure gate and prevented from, they're so privileged, and they need to drop their white Western privilege and respect that these people have been fighting for democracy for decades. Do you think that, when a prominent journalist makes those statements, it emboldens the people at the airport to act out?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the funny thing is, Melissa Chan says, "Oh, you guys should check your privilege. The Hong Kong airport has the best food. Go enjoy some caviar." And she does not even realize the irony, because she is of the class of caviar consuming, jet-setting, big-name journalists with a lot of privilege, and she's sitting in the safety of his Berlin office, saying all these people trapped in Hong Kong airport just trying to reach home for the weekend. You need to check your privilege. I mean, like, it's amazing.
All right, we're going to have to end part 1 there. Join us in part 2, and we're going to continue our discussion of the violent protests in Hong Kong and the U.S. role in fueling them. In part 2, we are going to continue our discussion with Carl Zha If you want to support this show, please go to patreon.com/moderaterebels and join us in part 2.